Imagine a German soldier, raised on tales of Nazi supremacy and unbeatable engineering, staring in disbelief at a simple American farm machine that could change the course of his life forever. What if everything he believed about his homeland's power was a lie, exposed not on the battlefield, but in the quiet fields of the Midwest? This is the untold story of Erich Müller, a prisoner of war whose eyes were opened to a world of abundance he never knew existed, and the impossible choice that followed. It was a crisp morning in June 1944, in the heart of rural Minnesota. Erich Müller, a 29-year-old mechanic from the rolling hills of Saxony, stepped off a rattling cattle truck onto the gravel lot of a vegetable warehouse. Captured in the dusty chaos of North Africa the previous year, he and 39 other German POWs had been transported from Camp Algona in Iowa to this remote branch camp in Moorhead. Dressed in faded blue denim overalls marked with bold PW letters, Erich carried only the weight of his shattered illusions from the front lines. Back home, he had tinkered with farm tools in his family's modest workshop, where tractors were rare luxuries reserved for the elite. Most fields were plowed by loyal draft horses, Percherons and Shires, that had powered German agriculture for centuries. Even as the Wehrmacht's tanks thundered across Europe, the army relied on over 3 million horses for supply lines, a fact that propaganda films conveniently glossed over. Erich had been indoctrinated to believe in the Reich's unmatched ingenuity. The Blitzkrieg's mechanical might was supposed to crush all opposition, yet he had trudged through Tunisia behind wagons pulled by seized animals from conquered lands. Only a fraction of German forces were truly motorized. The rest marched on foot or depended on equine endurance amid fuel rationing. Now, in enemy territory, he wondered what awaited him in this vast, unfamiliar land. Assigned to labor on local farms to fill the void left by 1,200 drafted young men from the county, Erich's group was shuttled daily to fields desperate for hands. The U.S. government, bound by Geneva Convention rules, compensated farmers at 45 cents per hour per prisoner, while the POWs earned 15 cents in camp credits for small comforts like cigarettes or soap. Erich's first placement was at the Larson farm in Clay County, owned by Lars Larson, a second-generation Danish-American whose ancestors had tamed the prairie with sheer grit and oxen teams. As sunlight pierced the barn's wooden slats, Erich froze at the sight before him. A sleek Allis-Chalmers Model WC tractor, its orange hue vibrant and purposeful. This 1942 model boasted hydraulic lifts and a streamlined design by engineers focused on farmer-friendly innovation. But what truly stunned him was the sheer plenty. 2 more tractors stood nearby, a Case SC and a Massey Harris 101, all humming with potential. In Germany, even prosperous estates might share one temperamental tractor among neighbors, often jury-rigged with makeshift parts due to wartime shortages. Here, one family commanded a fleet that could revolutionize entire villages back home. His guard, a kindly sergeant with roots in Bavaria, noticed Erich's wide-eyed gaze. "Familiar with engines?" he asked in halting German. "I fixed them before the war," Erich whispered, his fingers brushing the tractor's fender. It had pneumatic tires for smooth rides, a power takeoff for attachments, and even a comfortable seat, features that screamed efficiency and accessibility. German machines, by contrast, were often overcomplicated, built for scarcity, and increasingly stripped for the war effort, leaving farms to regress to pre-industrial methods. By mid-June, after a routine health check back at Camp Algona, a sprawling 300-acre facility costing over $1 million and housing thousands of Afrika Korps veterans, Erich rejoined his comrades in the rec hall. Whispered conversations turned heated. 3 tractors on one farm? Preposterous, scoffed Karl Becker, an ex-artillery engineer from the Ruhr. Our Führer's model farms in the films showed nothing like this. Erich leaned in. "I've touched them. They're real. And the harvesters? They do the work of dozens without breaking a sweat." Another prisoner, a Bavarian farmer named Otto Lang, murmured, "We were fed stories of American decadence and weakness. But this is strength we never imagined." The revelations piled on. American soil yielded bumper crops thanks to hybrid seeds and chemical fertilizers, innovations that boosted yields far beyond Europe's war-torn fields. Erich learned of the Dust Bowl's lessons, how contour-plowing and crop rotation had revived the plains, turning potential famine into surplus. It wasn't just machinery, it was a system of science and investment that Germany, obsessed with conquest, had overlooked. As July dawned, amid the hum of Independence Day fireworks echoing from afar, Erich shared a rare moment of camaraderie at the Larson farm. Though regulations forbade it, Lars offered the prisoners lemonade and fresh corn, sparking fragmented talks about land and legacy. "How big is this spread?" Eric asked through gestures and broken English. 200 acres, Lars replied, about 81 hectares, quadruple the size of Eric's family plot, yet managed by a handful with machines. In Saxony, such land would demand scores of laborers, many now lost to the front. That night, under a starlit sky in the warehouse barracks, Eric's mind raced. If America's farms were this advanced, what did that mean for their factories, their arsenals? The propaganda of inevitable victory crumbled like dry soil. Curiosity burned. Could this enemy nation hold the key to a better future, or was it all an illusion? The truth was unfolding, one revelation at a time, pulling him toward a crossroads he never anticipated. The revelations didn't stop with the tractors. As summer deepened into the relentless harvest season of 1944, Eric Muller began to see the full machinery of American agriculture unfold before him like a living textbook of efficiency and scale. Every morning at the Larson farm, he watched the self-propelled all-crop harvester rumble across the wheat fields. This single machine, operated by one man, cut the standing grain, threshed it, separated the kernels from the chaff, and poured clean grain into waiting trucks in one continuous pass. No bundles to shock, no hours spent pitching sheaves by hand, no clouds of dust choking the workers. In Saxony, harvest had always been a village event. Dozens of men, women, and children swinging scythes from sunrise to sunset, followed by weeks of threshing on stationary machines powered by whatever fuel or horsepower could be scraped together. A good year might yield 20 bushels per acre. Here, the Larsons routinely harvested 45 to 50 bushels per acre, thanks to hybrid seed varieties developed at land-grant universities, chemical fertilizers, and soil conservation practices born from the lessons of the Dust Bowl. Eric asked Lars one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow while unloading wheat sacks. "This yield, is it normal for your country?" Lars chuckled and pointed toward the horizon. "Normal for a decent year, yeah. My neighbor across the section line pulls 60 bushels some seasons. And out in the Red River Valley, they're talking about pushing 70 with the new varieties coming out." Eric did the mental arithmetic. 70 bushels per acre on land worked by machines instead of exhausted manpower. Back home, even the most optimistic Reich propaganda boasted of 25 bushels as a triumph of National Socialist agriculture. The gap wasn't just numbers, it was philosophy. Germany had bet everything on territorial expansion to feed its people. America had bet on science, investment, and machines. By late August, Eric had earned enough trust that Lars let him service the equipment without constant supervision. He tore down the Alice-Chalmers engine after it began misfiring, cleaned the carburetor, replaced a worn gasket, and had it purring again within hours. The parts were clean, standardized, and stocked in the barn's neatly labeled drawers. No scavenging, no improvisation, no waiting months for a single bolt from a distant factory. When he finished, Lars handed him a cold bottle of root beer from the icebox and said simply, "You're wasted on war, son. You belong with machines that build something instead of destroy it." That sentence lodged in Eric's chest like shrapnel. Back at the Moorhead Branch camp each evening, the prisoners traded stories. One man described a mechanical corn picker that stripped ears from stalks without ever touching the ground. Another spoke of irrigation pumps powered by electricity that ran 24 hours a day, turning dry acres into green abundance. A former Luftwaffe mechanic named Wilhelm recounted watching a farmer start his tractor with the push of a button. No hand cranking, no priming, no praying the magneto would spark. The cumulative weight of these observations pressed down on them all. The Reich had promised a 1,000-year empire built on racial destiny and technological mastery. Yet here, in the supposed decadent West, ordinary families wielded tools and knowledge that made the vaunted German war machine look primitive by comparison. September brought the soybean harvest, and with it a new lesson in scale. Eric rode beside Lars on the combine as it devoured row after row. The machine's header was wider than any reaper he had ever seen. Its grain tank held hundreds of bushels before needing to unload. When they finished a field, trucks rolled up immediately, no waiting, no bottleneck. The entire operation flowed like a factory assembly line transplanted to open land. Eric turned to Lars and asked the question that had haunted him for weeks. How many men did it take to farm this land before the machines? Lars thought for a moment. My grandfather broke this ground with 2 oxen and a walking plow. It took him and my grandmother, plus whatever neighbors could help, just to plant and harvest maybe 40 acres. Now one man with these tools can handle 4 times that, and still have time to go to town on Saturday night. 4 times the land. 1/4 the labor. Eric stared at the horizon where another combine worked in the distance, its dust plume catching the late afternoon sun. If American farms could feed their own population so easily and still produce mountains of surplus, then American factories, working on the same principles, could surely outbuild any nation on earth. The implications were terrifying. The war he had fought in was not merely a clash of armies. It was a contest between two entirely different ways of organizing human effort. One system starved its own people to feed conquest. The other fed the world while barely noticing the effort. October arrived with frost on the pumpkin vines and the final push of root crops. Eric worked longer hours, digging potatoes alongside American high school boys who had been excused from class to save the harvest. He listened to their chatter about college plans, football games, movie theaters, and new cars they hoped to buy after the war. They spoke of the future as something bright and certain. Eric had no frame of reference for such confidence. In Germany, the future had been sold as a promise of living space carved out by force. Here was being built one improved seed, one better machine, one repaired engine at a time. One evening, as they stacked crates in the cooling twilight, Lars's teenage daughter Ruth brought out a tray of apple pie still warm from the oven. She spoke no German, but her smile needed no translation. Eric accepted a slice and tasted cinnamon and sugar in quantities he had almost forgotten existed. For a moment the war felt far away. Then he remembered the letters from home that arrived sporadically, short, censored messages about air raids, dwindling rations, and neighbors disappearing into the night. The contrast was unbearable. Lying on his cot that night, Eric stared at the rafters and admitted to himself what he had been avoiding. The Germany he had sworn to defend no longer existed. What remained was rubble, hunger, and a collapsing myth. But across the ocean, in these quiet Midwestern fields, something durable was still growing, something that did not require conquest to survive. He closed his eyes and made the first quiet promise to himself. When the guns finally fell silent, he would not return to the ashes of the old world. He would stay and learn how to build the new one. As autumn faded into the bitter Minnesota winter of 1944-45, Eric Muller's world continued to tilt. The fields lay quiet under snow, but the lessons kept coming, now in the stillness of the equipment barn rather than the roar of harvest. Lars Larson asked Eric to stay on through the off-season for maintenance. With the guard's quiet approval, Eric spent long days in the heated barn, overhauling every piece of machinery on the place. He rebuilt the carburetor on the Alice-Chalmers, repacked wheel bearings on the case, adjusted the timing on the Massey Harris, and serviced the corn picker down to the last chain link. Every part he touched was clean, precisely machined, and, most astonishingly, replaceable from neatly organized shelves. No waiting 6 months for a shipment from Berlin. No filing down scavenged bolts to make them fit. American engineering had built not just powerful machines but forgiving ones, designed so a farmer with basic tools could keep them running for decades. One afternoon, while Eric was greasing the universal joints on the manure spreader, Lars leaned against the workbench and asked, "What do you think will happen to Germany when this is over?" Eric paused, the grease gun still in his hand. He had never been asked that question so directly. After a long silence he answered, "It will be broken. The city's gone. The people, very hungry. And ashamed." He looked up. "But maybe if we are lucky we can start again. Not the same way." Lars nodded slowly. "You know, if you wanted to stay when the war ends, I'd write a letter. Sponsor you. We could use a man who understands engines the way you do." The words landed like a shell that didn't explode right away. Stay. The idea felt treasonous and at the same time strangely inevitable. Eric had spent years being told that Germany was the future of the world. Now he was looking at the future and it wore orange paint and smelled of clean oil. Letters from home arrived in trickles, short, heavily censored, written in his mother's careful hand. Air raids every night. No coal. No potatoes. His younger brother missing somewhere on the Eastern Front. Each envelope felt thinner than the last, as though even the paper was being rationed. Eric read them in the dim light of the warehouse barracks, then folded them carefully and tried not to think about what he could not change. By February 1945 the news from Europe was unmistakable, even through the camp's tightly controlled radio. The Ardennes offensive had collapsed. The Red Army was across the Oder. Cologne and Dresden were burning. The prisoners no longer argued about victory. They argued about survival, about whether anything would be left to go home to. In March, when the snow finally retreated, Eric returned to field work. The first green shoots of spring wheat appeared, fragile and determined. He helped Lars plant corn with a 4-row planter pulled by the big Massey Harris. The machine dropped seed, fertilizer and insecticide in one pass, operations that in Germany would have taken 3 separate steps and 3 times the labor. Eric watched the rows unfold behind them, straight and even, and felt something loosen inside his chest. This was not magic. This was planning. Investment. Knowledge shared freely instead of hoarded for war. One evening in late April, as they finished planting the last field, Lars turned off the tractor and let the engine idle down. He looked at Eric and said quietly, "They're saying it's almost over. Hitler's finished. Berlin's surrounded." Eric stared at the black soil. He felt no triumph, no despair, only a vast, hollow clarity. The war he had believed in had never been about protecting farmers or craftsmen or poets. It had been about conquest dressed up as destiny. And conquest had lost to corn rows and quiet competence. May 8, 1945. V-Day. The camp commander read the surrender announcement through a megaphone. Some prisoners cheered. Some wept. Most simply stood in stunned silence. Eric walked back to the Larson farm the next morning with a strange lightness in his step. The war was over. The lie was over. What remained was the choice. Over the following months, while thousands of prisoners waited for slow ships back to a shattered continent, Eric quietly gathered the paperwork Lars helped him prepare. Character references. Work records. A formal offer of employment. Immigration forms filled out in careful block letters. The process was slow, bureaucratic, unglamorous, just like American abundance itself. But it moved forward. In October 1945, during the soybean harvest, Lars drove Eric into town to sign the final sponsorship affidavit. When they returned, Ruth was waiting on the porch with a small apple pie and a shy smile. Eric accepted the slice and, for the first time in years, allowed himself to imagine tomorrow without dread. January 1946. The last transport ships were loading at New York. Camp Algona was emptying. Eric Muller did not board any of them. On a freezing morning he stood in the county courthouse, raised his right hand, and took the oath of allegiance to a country that had defeated his own, and then offered him a place in it. Lars and Ruth stood beside him as witnesses. When the judge said, "Welcome to the United States, Mr. Muller," Eric felt the last piece of the old world finally fall away. He kept the name Eric Muller. He kept the memories of Brandenburg fields and the smell of diesel in the snow. But he no longer carried the weight of a myth that had promised everything and delivered ruin. Years later, people in Clay County would remember the quiet German mechanic who could diagnose a tractor by sound alone. They would tell their children how he rebuilt engines in the dead of winter, how he taught the local boys to time a magneto, how he married Ruth Larson in the little white church on the edge of town in 1948. They would say he never spoke much about the war, only about the land, the machines, and the stubborn miracle of ordinary abundance. Eric never forgot the tractors that first stopped him in his tracks. They had not been weapons. They had been proof that another way was possible. A way that fed people instead of starving them. A way that built instead of conquered. And in the end, that quiet proof had been stronger than any propaganda, any division, any thousand-year promise. He spent the rest of his life turning wrenches in service of that proof, because sometimes the most powerful revolution is the one that happens in a barn, under ordinary light, with grease on your hands and hope in your chest.